وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن والاه. Assalamu alaikum. Pray everybody is doing well. Good to see everyone, and thank you to our dearest sister Hafsa for your beautiful Quranic recitation. Now, inshallah ta'ala, before we begin, and I have a few resources that I want to share with all of you here, I just want to thank Sister Iman for coordinating this, and Sister Saldaf as well. Alhamdulillah, even though we're not able to be together in person, and I know many of us had hoped to attend the Rabat retreat this year, I am grateful that we are having this opportunity for dialogue. Even if it's called distance learning, one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that, the hearts of the believers are always connected, even across different, spans of distance and miles and geography and what have you. So I pray that everybody is in the best of health and spirits. And the topic, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides now, if that's okay. So the topic for, inshallah, if I can have that feature, the topic for today's discussion is how we as educators can understand this question of how to be allies, right, to Muslims, to Black Muslims, African American Muslims, to Muslims of African descent. So I have a few resources that I want to share with you, inshallah ta'ala, and let me see if I can do this. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen here. Bismillah. So there we are. So one of the things that I know with our esteemed group here is that I'm probably going to be sharing advice that I think is not going to be sort of difficult for any of you to grasp, in the sense that, as educators, one of the main things that we share in common, I see a question here, inshallah, we'll get to questions in just a moment, but one of the things that we have in common is that for those of us who are committed to education and da'wah, there's already sort of a built-in, I think, not assumption, but there's kind of a built-in recognition that diversity is always a strength. Diversity is a strength in terms of your ability to be able to educate and interact with multiple audiences, and diversity is certainly a strength when it comes to students, when it comes to, I think, the resources of an organization, when it comes to just the idea that the educational experience is enriched by being able to benefit from multiple perspectives, right? So there are certain things that we as educators, I think, already, certain operating principles that we already bring into our work. And there is this idea that of preaching to the choir, and one of the things that we often find ourselves doing in certain settings, especially in Muslim settings, is we often find ourselves preaching to that choir. And one of the things that we know as educators is that you want to be able to mix things up a little bit, right? Because growth and sort of and growth in terms of understanding, awareness, and cognition, growth tends to take place when as educators and also as students, we can be able to challenge those cognitive frames. Now, what's very interesting is that studies have shown that sometimes presenting sort of a list of facts to people does not necessarily get people to change their minds. Because one of the things that's very interesting about human beings is that we have actually shown this strange sort of tendency to where, when we are presented with facts that do not accord with the stereotypes and assumptions that we have formed about the people in the world around us, right, we'll often discount those facts, right? We will push them aside. In today's parlance, it's called fake news, right? We'll push these facts aside because they don't actually accord with the ill-informed view that we've developed or that we've acquired about the world around us. It's a very strange tendency of human beings, and this is why that dua, right? Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqan warzuqna ittiba'ah, right? Oh Allah, show us the truth as truth, and bless us to be able to follow it. Wa arina al-batila batilan warzuqna ijtinabah, and show us the falsehood as falsehood, and bless us to be able to avoid it is such an important and powerful dua to make, because again, sometimes as educators, and this has been my experience, and attending trainings on this, is that you think, say, for example, in the context of Islamophobia and dispelling stereotypes about Islam and Muslims, that if you stand before an audience and merely present that audience with a list of facts about Muslims, that they're going to become enlightened and they're going to jettison their negative views about Islam and Muslims, and then your work is done, right? What you'll actually find is an initial resistance from that audience. And I think it applies to this topic as well when it comes to dealing with racism. Because anti-Black racism and Islamophobia, as with many different forms of bigotry, actually intersect across multiple points. So just the mere presentation of these facts, again, people will actually, if these facts don't accord with their worldview, oftentimes they'll just sort of dismiss the facts. They'll push them aside. And unfortunately, they will persist, right, in certain assumptions. So this is where, as an educator, you have to understand that the presentation of facts, that this has to be supported with a few other elements, right? You have people to bring in context, right? You can't just list the facts devoid of context. You have to bring in context. This is where historical context is so important in combating racism and understanding the origins of anti-Black racism. So this is where historical context is key. And then as Muslims, what we also need to be able to understand is you have to speak to the heart. Because when you're able to, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses you to be able to speak to the heart, that's when those cognitive frames, that's when you can really challenge them. Now you do have, alhamdulillah, some people that on the basis of an intellectual argument that you can challenge those cognitive frames and perhaps expand them or even shatter them and rebuild them as need be, right? But for a lot of people, it's going to be through reaching that person's heart, through that person actually being able to embrace our shared humanity, right? As opposed to that person being presented with a list of facts. So this is what I would really emphasize for Muslim educators. Alhamdulillah, we have so many resources at our disposal, because ultimately, when we look at what is the model of education in Islam, right? It's not necessarily about appealing to someone's logic or rationality. We live in a very strange, post-rational age. It's just bizarre, especially being in the United States, looking at the fact that this is a political climate that has sort of opened the floodgates for where millions of people feel comfortable promoting the most baseless and wild conspiracy theories. It's a very, very strange time in which we live, where we have people at the highest levels of public office openly dismissing the role of expertise. It's a very, very strange time that we live in. So what I want us to understand as Muslims, that there is the model of Islamic education is to be able to appeal to the heart, and to have that person understand that if our desire, our objective is to appear before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, illa man atallaha biqalbin salim, as the Quran tells us, right? That on that day where nothing will avail of wealth and children, that the only thing that will avail people is that they come before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala biqalbin salim, right? How do we arrive at that? Is it through presenting a list of facts? I mean, that might be a starting point. But ultimately, it's for us as educators and those that Allah Ta'ala has blessed us to interact with, and the audience that we're trying to reach, the constituency that we're trying to reach, for us to understand that a heart that is sort of encrusted over, and a heart that is full of anger and jealousy and suspicion and arrogance and contempt and looking down on others and rancor and hatred and all these things. This is not a heart that's going to be primed so that we're able to appear before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our hearts are purified. So these are some of the points that I want to emphasize for our dear and respected sisters and educators who are with us today. All right, now, inshallah, if you will just from, if I just might pause just to kind of ask a more technical question, is our conversation just for the sisters that I see here, or is there an audience somewhere out there on YouTube or Facebook? Just so that I understand. I want to make sure to whom I'm addressing my nasiha. All right?
Yeah.
If you could just let me know.
I think we had an intention, with your permission, to ask you after this to record it and also put it on YouTube, if possible, through our Rabata channels, because we have that option.
Absolutely.
If it's okay with you.
Oh, absolutely. I'm very happy to do that. Okay. Thank you so much, Annie, saying that. I appreciate you. So this is why I wanted to share this ayah here. Let me see. Close out the chat box. So, okay. So, inshallah, hopefully everybody can still see what I'm sharing here. This ayah in the Quran, and this is chapter 30. So keep in mind, I have the ayah in the Quran, but then I have a quote from W.B. Du Bois. I don't have the translation here. So, but the ayah is Surah Al-Rum, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ. Surah Al-Rum has a very beautiful pattern of وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always reminding us to look for his signs and the creation, so many aspects of creation around us, some of these things that we often take for granted. So Allah Ta'ala tells us, بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ومن آياته خلق السماوات والأرض واختلاف ألسنتكم وألوانكم إن في ذلك لآيات للعالمين. Right? Not للعالمين, but للعالمين, right? So I love this ayah, and from the signs, from his signs, right? وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ, from his signs is the creation, i.e. from God's signs, is the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity in your languages and your complexions. And verily in that are signs for those endowed with knowledge, right? A direct connection being made in this ayah, right? Between people who are truly endowed with beneficial knowledge and their ability to appreciate and to celebrate the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as manifest in the diversity, the staggering diversity of humanity. You know, one of the things I always love to share, dear sisters, is that even though people will often ask me, well, how did it feel, say, to grow up, you know, in a multiracial household? I remember having this question many years back. A sister was writing me a letter. I lived in the Middle East, and there was a sister that I was kind of like corresponding with. We were pen pals. This is like well before the age of the internet and email. Like email wasn't even a thought back then, probably. So I'm dating myself here. And in the letter, she was so intrigued by this idea of growing up biracial. And she wanted to know how did that feel? And honestly, I was at a loss as to tell her how it felt, because my parents never ever emphasized that. Like, Wallah al-Azim, I never ever heard this term biracial growing up. And it's so interesting because nowadays, when I'm asked by, mashallah, different organizations to do presentations on this subject, you know, and then my picture appears in a flyer, I actually have some people out there in Facebook and internet land saying, well, why is she speaking to this? She's not African American, she's not Black. So then I actually find myself having to kind of dig back into my memory here, my archives here, and say, you know what? Let's actually unpack this term here, right? What it means to identify as one particular, you know, ethnicity or race, and the implications for us as Muslims. And, you know, again, this is why we're having this conversation, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this ayah is actually not telling us that we need to be colorblind. Because I think one of the things that, you know, when you kind of grow up in a household that's very kind of, where parents come from diverse backgrounds, that, you know, you learn to navigate these issues of identity in interesting ways. And one of the things that I always heard growing up, more than this idea of biracial or multiracial, was this idea of Islam as colorblind. Now, we're not going to discuss race at all, just because there's so much, you know, sort of historical baggage that can sort of come along with that. And that ultimately, and this is something that my mother and father taught me, and they believe, of course, and I completely agree with them, right? Because their belief is valid, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran does not divide human beings up into different sort of races, right? So we are told in the Quran, well, number one, we're told that this is an intention of God, that we're diverse in terms of the languages we speak and our skin colors. But then we also have this beautiful ayah in the Quran. This is 49:13. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ya ayyuhan nas inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ خَبِيرٌ. Right? So now we're given terminology to use, right? شُعُوب and قَبَائِل. These terms actually don't really have much to do with racial categories, because we know that ultimately there is no biological basis for race. However, race is a reality in terms of being, a socioeconomic and political construct. It's a reality that people of color, and especially people of African descent, have had to grapple with for the past 400 years of Atlantic world history, right? So we can't discount the way that this reality has impacted the lives of countless generations. So when we make this argument that Islam is colorblind, as much as I understand the intention behind this argument, right? In fact, there was an esteemed sheikha the other day who said, look, I see everyone as the same, black, white. I don't see, and I've heard the sentiment from some of our scholars and teachers who come from immigrant or transnational backgrounds, that they see everyone, they don't see race, they see everyone the same. And as of course, as well-intentioned as the sentiment is, it perhaps does not give us as educators all of the tools, maybe some of them, but not all of the tools that we need to very sort of creatively and honestly be able to grapple with what it means for human beings, right, and the Western and Northern Hemisphere, to deal with the fact that there is an entire edifice that's been constructed on the basis of race. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He created us into different communities, right? Shu'ub, right? These are peoples. Qaba'il, usually qaba'il is it's the plural of the term qabila. Usually we understand it as tribe, right? So we know that there's this diversity is obviously part of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's larger design for us, right? And of course the Quran, this idea of race, the Quran does not support this. And I understand where people are coming from. But we also, as Muslims, we have to have the appropriate tools, right? And like I'm saying, when we make this response of, well, I don't see race, I don't see this, I don't see that, Islam is colorblind, as well-intentioned as that is, that kind of flattening out of all these differences, it doesn't actually help us to be able to wade into these conversations in a meaningful way and actually address very real issues of bias, discrimination, and racism that we even encounter in our own communities, right? So, if, for example, if someone comes to us with complaints, say about, maybe something they experience at the masjid or an Islamic school or what have you, and then we quote this ayah for them, and alhamdulillah, right? All of us understand the significance of this ayah, right? And theoretically, you'd like to think that all of us as Muslims would be able to see this ayah and say, you know what? A'udhu billah, astaghfirullah, I seek refuge in Allah Ta'ala, I seek Allah Ta'ala's forgiveness for, any prejudice I might harbor in my heart. But, quite honestly, do we as human beings work that way, right? We need to, as educators, figure out that how do we actually take these beautiful ideals, these lofty ideals that we have here in the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and actually translate them in a way to where we can really combat anti-Black racism. I'll share an anecdote with you. This is something I've been thinking about a lot. There's a student. This is in my local community, but this is a very lovely young lady from Sudanese background. And we were having a conversation recently over social media about the importance of combating anti-Black racism within our community. and she shared a painful story of having gone to an Islamic school and hearing racial slurs from her Muslim classmates. And our dear young sister is not alone, sadly, in having had this experience. You know, when I was still traveling, I can't tell you how many different communities I visited. This is within the United States, and visiting communities and sitting with African American families and hearing about this retreat from Islamic, i.e., this sort of decision of parents to pull their kids out and leave, depart, right, Islamic schools because of the racism. And to me, it was just so, speaking of, you know, speaking about cognitive frames and having our cognitive frames challenged. Now, again, we often have very we look at the idea of an Islamic school through these rose-tinted lenses. Alhamdulillah, you know, look at our Muslim families sending their kids to Islamic school. You know, we have this idea that all the kids, mashallah, are little saints, and, you know, and that by being in this sort of what we think is a selective, rarefied atmosphere of being in an Islamic school, that we're not going to see certain behaviors or hear certain language, right? And then you talk to parents and students, and then you're hearing that students are being exposed to racial invective, to misogynistic language, right? Where is this coming from? So again, we need to do a better job as parents and educators, right? So that these ayat in the Quran are not just, you know, closed away in our mushaf that's sitting on a shelf somewhere collecting dust. And meanwhile, the attitudes and assumptions, right, that are kind of circulating through our community are being unchallenged. So the young sister said that, you know, again, the school, again, this is, and this is not coming from a place of criticism, not at all, but I think it's not being equipped with the proper tools to combat these issues, right? You know, the response to the school was basically, well, okay, we're going to have a halaqah during lunch hour on Sayyidina Bilal. All right, again, that's that let's present them, let's hit them with the list of facts approach. That's not going to change, that's not going to address the spiritual malady and pathology of kibr that has lodged in the hearts of people that have these attitudes, right? It's not going to address the fact that by and large, these kids aren't coming up with these ideas themselves or getting them from somewhere, right? Whether they're getting them from friends, from peers, from popular culture, from parents, from community members, Allahu A'lam, right? But it's not going to address where they're actually getting these ideas from. Children are not born with these ideas and assumptions, they're not. They have to be, unfortunately, they acquire them from somewhere. And it's largely from either the household or the larger, the family or the larger society. So, you know, so just going and presenting a halaqah on Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu ta'ala is not enough. I mean, it's a starting point, but, right, it also, it doesn't give us the ability to proactively become anti-racist, right? And so, and there's a really interesting book. Let me kind of go ahead. And so there's this book by Ibrahim Kendi, and how to be an anti-racist. And I just find the title so intriguing, because what he's really arguing here is that we have to be anti-racist in a very active and proactive way. It's not enough just to sit back in a very passive way and shrug our shoulders and say, well, I'm not racist, right? That's a very passive way of looking at this. We actually have to take steps to interrogate the assumptions we hold, what we're teaching our children, the assumptions that the people around us hold, and actively seek to be an anti-racist. And that's being in a position of a lot of activity, right? It's a very dynamic kind of place to be in. It's not passive. It's not being complacent, right? It's not saying, well, you know what? I'll do a nice little halaqah on Sayyidina Bilal and that should be the end of it, right? That does not help us necessarily be anti-racist, because what it suggests, well, first of all, as some, I think Imam Dawood might have suggested, or Imam Muhammad Mendes, I think we were having a talk about this the other day. There's a certain, probably Imam Dawood Walid, who's the author of this excellent book right here. So here's another good resource for you centering Black narrative, Black Muslim nobles amongst the early pious Muslims. Really good book, because what Imam Dawood is saying here is that we need to be careful not to present the story of Sayyidina Bilal in a way that tokenizes him, to where Sayyidina Bilal radiallahu ta'ala anh, that oh, we don't have a problem. How can we have a problem of racism in our community? We have Sayyidina Bilal, didn't he call the adhan? As if somehow our engagement with issues of racial discrimination and bias, that somehow our engagement, the extent of our responsibilities starts and it ends with Sayyidina Bilal, right? Not at all, right? This should be a starting point to spark certain conversations, because we also have the very important story, right, that took place during the time of the Prophet, right, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to where Bilal himself was dealing with racism from one of the Sahaba, right? And this tells us something. It's not, we have this very kind of rose-tinted notion that as soon as someone says, I'm a Muslim, and La ilaha illallah, Muhammad Rasulullah, that person is now a saint, and they're going to be disabused of any sort of, what's the word, any type of prejudicial feelings against somebody that's not from their immediate sort of ethnic group or what have you. I mean, in theory, right? But practically speaking, people unfortunately have these because they're spiritual diseases, these diseases of the heart. And then of course we've also been shaped in large part by our environment. And unless we do the very difficult work of actively addressing these issues and re-educating our community, right, about the dangers of anti-Black racism, and learning how to actively become not just people who just shrug our shoulders and say, Alhamdulillah, we've got this ayah, we have this hadith, we have Sayyidina Bilal, we're done with this. But how do we build upon that to actively be people who are anti-racist, right? So that story about Sayyidina Bilal, inshallah, let me know if I need to, when I should begin to wrap up for Q&A, but that story of Sayyidina Bilal is really instructive, because Sayyidina Bilal dealt with a racist comment from Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, another companion. So we have Sayyidina Bilal and Sayyidina Abu Dharr. And we know that there was some type of conversation that took place, right? And not all the ahadith tell us necessarily what was the topic of conversation, nor why Abu Dharr responded the way he did. But Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, an eminent companion, this is someone that, that Abu Dharr, by the way, is someone who came to Mecca, he came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to actively to learn about Islam. And he becomes Muslim, right? So this is not somebody of weak faith, and he was told to actually not discuss he become Muslim, but in a very public way. I think he went to the Kaaba and informed the Quraysh he'd become Muslim, and they beat him within an inch of his life. So this is not someone that we can accuse of being wavering iman. But even someone like Abu Dharr thought it was appropriate. Again, this is this kind of socio-cultural conditioning. He thought it was appropriate to refer to Sayyidina Bilal as, oh, you son of a Black woman. He didn't say this in a way that was intended to be a compliment. This was intended to be an insult. And that also tells us something about the Jahili, Arabia during the time of Jahiliyyah before Islam, right? That even in that time, while their understanding of Black and white was, of course, it's not parallel to the way we understand these terms today, right? They had obviously their own understanding of what it meant to have one complexion or to be of one group over another, right? That's why you should look at Imam Dawood-Walid's book to get a sense of how the Arabs during the time of the Prophet ﷺ understood, issues of ethnicity and race and belonging and so on, right? But it tells us something about the culture that even during that time, right, to say that someone was the son of someone who was Sauda, Black, right, it carried certain connotations. And it was not meant to be something that was a compliment for Sayyidina Bilal. So Sayyidina Bilal went to the Prophet ﷺ, and this is a very famous story. And the Prophet ﷺ say, well, you know what, Sayyidina Bilal, Islam is colorblind. We don't need to worry about this issue. Be patient. Just kind of let this thing sort of simmer down. We'll worry about this later. Was that his response? his response was to address it head on and in a very, very loving but candid way. He told Abu Dhar that you are a man that in you is still something of jahiliyyah, right? And this needs to be our response. Yes, so if we do have an unfortunate incident in the school where students are using racial slurs, let's give them this sort of piece of you know, the halaqa is fine. Giving them a sense of early Muslim history is fine. But it's also being able to tell that person in a very real way. And of course, if you're dealing with a minor, you have to bring in the parents. You absolutely have to bring in the parents. But to tell that person in a very real way that this is completely unacceptable. By using this type of disparaging language and racial slur against a fellow Muslim, not only are we manifesting the traits of jahiliyyah, but we as Muslims are buying into a system of white racial supremacy. This is what we need to have our community members understand. This is not just it's not just an individualized moral failing if someone uses this kind of language, because see, when you reduce it to an individualized moral failing, you don't have to address the underlying issues and the underlying structure of white supremacy that's produced this. You can ignore that altogether, right? When you just make it a character flaw. A character flaw is you give that person a slap on the wrist and say, oh, be nice and I don't know, apologize. Assuming an apology is even given, and then you're done with it. That's not enough. That we need to understand that when, for many people immigrating to this country, right, it became quickly apparent to many immigrant and transnational Muslims that there is a system of white racial privilege. There's a hierarchy, and you want to be able to buy into that and access that as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, the shortcut way to doing that is by putting down and marginalizing African Americans and people of color. And this has been an unfortunate dynamic within our American Muslim Ummah that we have to address, right? And I can speak from, again, these multiple perspectives because my mother is African American and my father is Arab American. And it was my own grandfather in Massachusetts who I believe petitioned for Lebanese and Syrians to be identified as white, because he saw in that basically entree to a particular level of status. Right? And along with that was also, unfortunately, that he taught my father and his siblings to have prejudicial and biased views against African Americans and Jews. Right? Again, where do these ideas and these attitudes come from? There's a certain system and assumptions that are being bought into. Now, alhamdulillah, when my father went off to college and met my mother, who's African American, again, he had to, these cognitive frames had to be challenged. These things that he'd heard growing up about African Americans and Jews, they had to be challenged. And for my parents, becoming Muslim allowed them to transcend so many of the sort of assumptions about other people that they were raised with. It gave them the space actually allow them to step into this very courageous space of saying that I can acknowledge the humanity in this other person and marry somebody across lines of race and ethnicity. It was their understanding of Islam that actually allowed them to do that. So inshallah, I think that I'm going to begin to wrap up because I want to also get to the Q&A part of this. But as educators, again, Allah Ta'ala has blessed you to be in a position of a great deal of influence. And especially, again, going back to that scenario in the school, right? That, you have the ability, because with the students looking up to you as mentors and as role models, that you have the ability to have conversations with them that maybe are not taking place at home, right? And to begin to challenge what is often, unfortunately, a very casual racism that can take place within our community. For anybody of Arab background, you know what I'm talking about, referring to people, Black people as abid and this and these things that we've all heard, right? That we as educators can challenge this. And what we can say, right, as people of faith is to our community members, do you really want to throw your lot in with what is a very kind of shaitanic worldview? Because we know ultimately the very first instance of kibr and racism, it takes place in that vignette, right, that unfolds in the Garden of Eden, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs the angels that he's creating the human being, and the angels push back against that, and Iblis is commanded to bow down before Adam in recognition of the potential of this new creation, and aba wastakbar, and he becomes he refuses and defies God and becomes arrogant, and that's how he becomes shaitan, who is the outcast, right? Cast out from Allah Ta'ala's mercy because of his open defiance of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala's order and his refusal to bow down before Adam, because he's like, why should I bow down before this thing that you created from clay and you created me from fire? What is that about, right? As Muslims, do we want to throw our lot in with that mentality, right? Do we want to, whether we realize it or not, right, on the level of our community, support a system, a 400-year-old system of racism and discrimination that has made it so that even to this day, that with all of the gains in the wake of the civil rights movement and the movement for Black liberation, that still African Americans are finding that racism is still lethal. Whether we are talking about what happens in the context of police brutality and law enforcement, or we're talking about the disparity in health outcomes. You know, and of course, if you're reading the headlines, you're seeing what's happening in the United States with COVID-19 and the surge of infections. Who is being disproportionately impacted by this? Communities of color. So Jazakumullah khair for allowing me to have this conversation. There's so much more that, of course, that I'd like to share, but I am confident that, mashallah, given the work that you're already doing as educators, as allies, that I'm confident that inshallah ta'ala you'll take some of these points and build on them and use them to benefit those around you, inshallah ta'ala. Barakallahu feekum. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept from all of you. Ameen. And please let me know at this time if there are any questions I can get to.
Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah khair, Ustadha Zaynab. SubhanAllah, so much to unpack. So we will open the floor for questions and answers. And everybody, if you guys are comfortable and free, please don't be shy. Put yourself on camera, so that way we can really, create a connection in this time of COVID where we're so separated. But if we can come together for such an important topic, then it will bring more light in this world. Before we start, I'm so sorry. One thing that I want to say also, we're so proud to have you, Ustadha Zaynab, and Ustadha Hafsa, who recited Quran at the beginning. Ustadha Hafsa is one of our first class graduates for our Ribaat certification program. So that's awesome. Please keep all the graduates in your duas. And Ustadha Zaynab is also one of our teachers at the Ribaat. So if you want to learn more from her, definitely I put in the link in the chat. Don't be shy to sign up to one of our amazing classes.
Thank you so much, Ansa Iman. I teach Introduction or Understanding the Muslim World.
Yes.
So delighted to support Sheikha Tamra and the efforts of Rabata and Ribaat.
Alhamdulillah. So is anyone ready for question? We can either type it in the chat. Let me see. Where's my moderator? Hold on. We have a chat moderator. Mariam, do we have any? Yes, okay, I see you typing. So if you have, and you can send me the questions and I can ask them, or if people are comfortable to come on camera, we can also give you the mic.
All right. Yes, inshallah. Okay. And if you could moderate the chat box for me, because the chat box, I always lose track of it, mashallah. But while we're waiting for the questions, there are just a couple more titles that I wanted to share. So this is, some other, if you want something that's kind of more of a sort of a theological, an examination of theodicy, that branch of theology that deals with that perennial question of suffering and evil. right? Dr. Sherman Jackson has an excellent book, Islam and the Problem of Black Suffering, which I think is a very important addition to your library. So this is a book that you want to check out. Also, if you're looking for, I can also recommend a number of books looking at the African American Muslim experience. Also, Sherman Jackson, for example, also has Islam and the Black American, looking toward the third resurrection. So there are any number of titles that I could recommend for you all as educators. If you're looking for something to actually assign to your, to your students, I need to actually put this in my slides, subhanAllah, but there's this book right here. Obviously, the Autobiography of Malcolm X, right? This really should be required reading for all of us. And, I think one of the most famous stories that we're probably familiar with is Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, and, when he went to Mecca, right? And this is post-NOI, post-Nation of Islam, and how that experience going on Hajj challenged everything that he thought he knew about race and the potential for human beings to experience true brotherhood. I mean, it was, again, this idea of challenging cognitive frames. And even though for some of us, of course, reading this 50 years later, we might be a little bit cynical, we need to understand that moment, that Malcolm X was an astute observer. And for him to have the experience of going on Hajj and to interact with people that would have been, in this context, identified as white, but they didn't have this attitude of whiteness about them, was something so amazing for him. And I think we need to be able to recognize his potential in all of us, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, tells us, right, that for people endowed with knowledge, that they understand that these differences should not divide us, but instead should unite us in appreciation for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his signs, his ayat. Also, so there's Ibram Kendi's book. There's this title right here. Now, just because I have a title doesn't mean I endorse everything that the author says necessarily, but still, I think maybe for good introductory reading, this might be an interesting book. And the title's pretty great. So, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, right? This book was pretty much intended for a non-African American audience with this title right here. So this is one book that you might want to look up. This is only if you really want to do some reading about Southern history. It's a very difficult read, this book, Trouble in Mind, Black Southerners in the Age of Jim Crow. It's very, very painful, very traumatic. But like I said, it's those of us who, subhanAllah, who are in these positions where we have somewhat of a public platform, we really need to gain an understanding of just the historical trauma that people of African descent have faced in this country. And again, we're talking about 400 years of oppression, enslavement, subjugation, discrimination, basically codified violence, and what this means for a community. The other day we were having a discussion in our local community where we were trying to center Black voices. And one of the things I want to emphasize really for all of us here is just to have the ability to kind of step back and sit down and listen, open our hearts, open our minds, open our ears, and just listen. I think for too often we've been dismissive of the concerns and complaints and experiences of African Americans. People have even shared with me this idea, why should I even care about this? This is, these are Black issues. What does this have to do with me? We should never hear that from a Muslim, but unfortunately we hear these things, right? So for those of you that want to know more of the historical background, this is another title. Okay, so do we have any questions coming in?
I had a question.
Yes.
Just to give you a little bit more context of the Canadian context. Here in Canada, the majority of the Blacks, quote unquote, are the Somalis. And then we have the Caribbean community, which are the convert community. One of our main leader, I guess, would be Sheikh Abdel Hakim Quick. And subhanAllah, I had a meeting with him and his family this week where they want to bring out the narratives of the elders that were in Toronto early on. And one thing that we all realize is that these narratives were not told. These stories are not being told. And when the other immigrants from Africa came, their story became prevalent, and the Caribbean convert community was pushed aside. Because often what I hear from my own community here in Toronto is that these issues only are in the United States. So that's why when I speak to them, I tell them there's a difference between the struggle of the African American that, yes, includes anti-Black racism and also systematic racism, but the anti-Black racism is everywhere. I'm sorry, whether you talk about Canada, the UK, that feeling is there. And I'm so happy you mentioned the story of Bilal, because often, especially in religious settings, in Sunday schools, from alimas, that's the response that you get. As soon as you mention racism, anti-Black racism, they come out with the story of Bilal to just kind of make themselves feel better. So whoever is Canadian here, one thing that I would like to say, and I'm so happy Ustadha Zaynab mentioned this, is please, let's not take this as an American issue, because it's two different discussions. I don't know if I'm making sense. It's two different discussions. Yes, we have to support our African American brothers and sisters because they need their freedom. But here in Canada, we are also impacted because a lot of us, like I'm from Haitian background, so my parents were from Haiti, meaning the African slaves that were in Africa were brought to the Caribbeans. So you have that connection with trauma, and you have that and then we were colonized. So that's just a whole mess. So my point in saying that is when you interact with people of African descent here in Canada, don't think that the narratives are separated because we're not physically in the US. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. And Ustadha Zaynab, you mentioned tools. What other tools, like for example, you're a teacher, but in your head, all these things are not coming in your head, or let's say you don't think you have inner biases. Would you recommend, what kind of training do you think a teacher could have or could take before eventually starting to teach that? Because I think they need to recognize it, get trained, and then address the issue.
Thank you so much, Auntie Iman. Alhamdulillah, and thank you for sharing your background. And I remember a long time ago being in school, and I think we looked at the history of Haiti, and that was like the sole successful uprising of African people in the Western Hemisphere. And yeah, subhanAllah, I just remember how fascinating Toussaint Louverture and that history, and why don't we hear about him along with George Washington, and just, yeah. So every Muslim should read about the history of Haiti, mashallah. But in terms of tools, that's a great question, Ansi Iman. So again, I would say, because my advice, I know I was asked to give advice for people that are outside of the African American community or people who don't identify as Black. And I think that there is sort of a process that people have to go through in terms of being very honest with ourselves, because we don't always tell ourselves the truth, right? And sometimes we think that, hey, you know what, if I'm not using overtly like bigoted language, then it's okay, I'm not racist, right? But subhanAllah, we have to understand there are just so many subtle ways that all of us are impacted by the sort of the structures of white supremacy, and if we come from overseas, colonialism. And I think for me, Ansi Iman, one of the things I would suggest that we consider is the role of language. So I do have some other things I wanted to share here, resources for you all. Muslim ARC, sisters. So I think that one of the main things that we might want to do is actually locate those people, mashallah, in our local community, or if we don't have those resources immediately available, maybe look at a little bit beyond that to say, instead of just saying, mashallah, I'm going to read my ayat in the Quran, I'm going to read the farewell sermon, I'm going to say Sayyidina Bilal, alhamdulillah, I'm good. That's a good starting point. Right? And of course, we should always be coming back to the guidance in the Quran, always, and asking Allah Ta'ala to give us that clarity of heart. But it also means working with people that are actively addressing these issues on the ground. So Muslim ARC, the Anti-Racism Collaborative, it's based here in the United States. This might be a good resource to look into. There are some toolkits as well. Alhamdulillah, more and more organizations are beginning to develop toolkits just because they recognize precisely what Ansi Iman said, that we might not always sort of instinctively know how to speak to these issues. So there is, this is Yaqeen Institute has, I think, by now they've developed several toolkits on how to address racism within our community and beyond, and how to be an ally. They have a lot of good resources and activism. I think is especially useful if you are partnering, say, maybe with organizations outside the Muslim community. Just certain things to be aware of in terms of how our activism looks when we're forming alliances with organizations that might be more progressive and more liberal. And then also the FYI, the Family and Youth Institute has, they released some time ago, this was probably about in the last 6 months or so, if I'm not mistaken, the Uplifting Black Muslim Youth Toolkit. It's really excellent, right? And again, because for those of us that are, maybe we have diverse students in our classrooms and we want to be able to be an ally to those students, right? You know, I think that we really want to make sure that we have the resources at our disposal so that we can really be there for those students in a meaningful way, because it can become very hurtful to our students if, say, they experience some, you know, instance of racism, and as educators, we just don't know what to do. We either, you know, what's the word, you know, we shrug our shoulders. There might be an inclination to, oh, that person is just, you know, let's make dua for them, they're ignorant, and that's the end of it. You know, again, we need to have kind of more thoughtful ways of addressing that. And then let's not ever make the mistake of, well, you know, maybe they didn't really say that, right? No, they did. So another thing that I wanted to mention is that we need to be vigilant about what people call microaggressions, right? Because I think most of us, like, if something is just like blatant, right, in our faces, we know what that looks like and how to tackle it, hopefully, right? But microaggressions, manifestations of ethnocentrism, tribalism, asabiyya, right, and racism, to be able to recognize these things and call them out, that's also very important.
Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair. That was subhanallah. So, okay, so I think Amina, you had a question? Amina, I said Amina, let me see, Amina, where you are.
And I see a question here also, Auntie Iman. There's a Sister Iman Ismail has a question here.
Yes, go ahead, you can address it.
Okay, this is a really good question. And that's, how can we translate the need for allyship and anti-racism education to other societies, other cultural contexts, especially those that are sensitive, or look at these things as taboo topics. And she's actually writing from the Arab Gulf. I mean, this is a really important question. Again, this is why we really have our work cut out for us, right? Because we have to be skillful enough to recognize that this issue, this problem, this malady of anti-Black racism, right? It's not uniquely North American, right? It's not just Atlantic world problem. Sadly, it's universal. And I think one of the main areas where we have to really kind of play catch up in the Muslim world, right, in terms of the Middle East and South Asia, is that a lot of times there is not even foundational awareness of the problem, right? People really have the blinders on. I've lived in the Middle East, so I can say this, right? A lot of times the vocabulary is lacking to even address these issues. There's little foundational awareness that these societies also suffer from racism and colorism and classism. You know, living in Iran, for example, many years ago, right? We were shocked to actually discover that there were actually Black Iranians. And if you were to kind of if you were to sort of grabbed and maybe if you were to have conducted an average kind of like man on the street kind of survey and asked Iranians about the presence of Black people, they wouldn't have had a clue about people in their own country. So there is a lot of education that has to be done in terms of raising awareness in Muslim societies about, because you find African diasporas in many Middle Eastern and South Asian societies, but sadly they're almost invisible. And for many of them, their origins actually go back to, sadly, to a slave trade that went in the other direction, out of sub-Saharan Africa into different parts of the Muslim world. And this is totally the elephant in the room, because no one actually wants to discuss Muslim involvement in these processes. And I think until we have, a reckoning as Muslims with our own sad and sometimes sordid history, we're not going to be able to address these issues on the ground.
Assalamualaikum, Ustadha. There was another question in the chat. The question was, do you have any tips to give to encourage our imams to engage in this discussion? This person, she's in Montreal. She feels that our mosques in Montreal haven't really shown any supports as if they're choosing to ignore the problem, as if it doesn't exist in our communities. And it's very hurtful to witness the inaction of our leaders, our imams in mosques.
Yes, inshallah. I'm going to take this question. I think we'll probably have to wrap up at this point. Now, we just had the 1 hour, correct?
We have a little bit more time, so it's okay.
Okay.
Unless, well, we're going to follow your time. We're going to be respectful to your time. So you tell us. But we have time, but we want to be respectful to your time as well. Thank you.
Okay, inshallah. We'll go for a few more minutes. I do have to get ready for another panel. So please forgive me. This is something that my dad actually asked me to do.
No
so
problem.
I want to be, but alhamdulillah, I think we can still get to a couple more questions. You know, I actually, I understand, mashallah, Sister Marlene, thank you so much. You know, this seems to be a challenge that many of us are facing. You know, even in my own community, I had to do a certain amount of lobbying, quote unquote, to actually say that, hey, you know, this was actually the week. So just to give you a little bit of background, this was the first Friday of the week where George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. I did a certain amount of sort of gentle nudging, let's call it that, so that we could, as a community, address this. And the Jum'ah khutbah was very concerned that there was not necessarily a universal recognition that this needed to actually be the topic of the khutbah. So alhamdulillah, since that time, you know, largely kind of focusing my nasiha on people behind the scenes. Alhamdulillah, you know, we had a panel, which was really the first for our community where I am here in Eastern Tennessee. We had a panel that was African American, and this was a first to center African American Muslim voices. It was a really beautiful talk, and to reflect on the murder of George Floyd, and to center again the experiences of African American Muslims, and to consider why those voices have been silenced in so many of our communities. So we had a panel, alhamdulillah. We had 1 or 2 khutbahs on the subject. We had, alhamdulillah, some of our community members actually went out and joined those protests that were taking place. Alhamdulillah, they were fairly peaceful in this community. And there's been continuing interest from the masjid in terms of, there was a statement that was released, and there's been continuing interest in the masjid in terms of what can we actually do to make sure that we kind of go beyond the statement and the panel, what are the next steps. So what I would say, based upon, you know, the only reason I'm sharing my personal experience to Marlene is just because I thought, it might be helpful to answer your question, that a lot of times change within our communities begins with someone just feeling strong enough to kind of push the issue, and it might ruffle feathers. Sometimes, you know, based on where people are and what they're dealing with and their own concerns, not everybody actually wants to receive that gentle nudge and be told that, hey, we really need to be addressing this issue in our khutbahs, right? You'll get different responses from people kind of based upon where they are, and that's fine. Be patient, but be persistent. And like I shared with a sister, I think around that time, I said, you know, if you... Yes. All right, I'm sorry, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. So I would say be persistent, because I think that if you are in a position in your community to where you can actually go to the imams, and one thing I'll say, it's not necessarily apathy, right? It can be the imam feels ill-equipped to address the topic. And one of the things that I did was I actually wrote up a list of talking points, Jum'ah talking points for imams in Atlanta, in Masajid in Atlanta, just in recognition of the fact that people are pressed for time, they often feel ill-equipped to address these issues, and we can actually make it easier by even putting together maybe a list of suggested talking points to kind of help them get these ideas out.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Jazakallah khair. I think we're just to respect Ustada's time, we'll take one more question. Is that okay, Ustadha Zaynab? And then we'll have to wrap up. Or if you need to wrap up right now.
No, we can take one more. So there's a question about Malaysia, and this is a comment, and I think this is a really great comment. I've never been to Southeast Asia, so of course I would be reluctant to comment. But mashallah, Sister Badriya is noting that in Malaysia, that she sees, to the detriment of her Malay community, that there's kind of a sense of giving certain privileges to one ethnic group over another. And there are post-colonial issues to consider as well. Yes, we all have our work cut out for us. Now, I do believe that there are larger universal principles that I think all of us can draw upon as educators. But in terms of like the specific details of on-the-ground training and sort of educational efforts, those will have to be addressed to the needs of the society, and they'll have to be tackled by experts who understand, their own specific communities, right? But I would have to say all of us, whether we are talking about Muslims in the Middle East and Southeast Asia and Southwest Asia and Africa, that we have, to one extent or another, that we have all been impacted by colonialism. And I think we're still trying to figure out, many of us, post-colonialism, how to deal with that legacy. And my experience has been living in the Middle East that we're not necessarily able to grapple with these issues the way that we need to be, that there needs to be an awakening to these issues. So alhamdulillah, I really do appreciate how thoughtful this conversation has been. Let me see if there are any other questions. It looks like I've gotten to the questions here in the chat box. So let me know if I missed anything. There was a question about shelters, women's shelters, from Sister Nijat. So maybe, Ansa Iman, if you could maybe share some resources, but she had a question about shelters for women, Black and brown women who are victims of domestic violence.
Yes, I saw that. In Toronto, we'll have to do some research. I don't think we have shelters for women, but specifically for Black Muslim women, that's not something that we have. But we do have Nisa homes and Sakina homes that are shelters for women. So we won't keep you longer. Unfortunately, this has been such a fruitful and amazing conversation. MashaAllah, I really like the fact that you gave us practical tips, because I find that often when we're having this discussion, it's so big picture that a lot of people can get lost in the conversation. So I like this practical advice, and that's what we wanted to do by creating this series. So inshallah, we won't quickly, if I'm going to ask you before you have to let us go, and we're really sad to see you go, if you can just end us with a quick dua, inshallah, and then we'll close for today.
Absolutely, I'm very happy to do that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sallam. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the provision and the blessings to reenact the mu'akhah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That in the time of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless that community with the mutual aid and support of the Muhajirin and the Ansar. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be able to step into those roles in our day and age, to be the Ansar for those who are looking for the Ansar, right? To be the Muhajirin as well, in terms of bringing to those around us the recognition that the hijrah, even after the Fatah Mecca, the opening of Mecca, that there is always a hijrah, and that hijrah is towards that which is pleasing to Allah Ta'ala. So my dua, my supplication is that I ask Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala to give all of us the tawfiq for obedience, for devotion, and to migrate in the direction of that which is pleasing to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to strengthen in all of us the bonds of sisterhood, and to bless all of us with a true suhbah and companionship that is rooted in faith and appreciation and humility. The humility to recognize the shared humanity and commonalities in each and every one of us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow the Muslim community to be that community that is an ummatan wasata, a balanced community that stands up and speaks out for justice and for equality and for support of those who are the mustada'afin, those who are oppressed in the earth. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to elevate our intention, to purify our actions, to forgive our sins and mistakes and shortcomings, and to make us of that ummah that when the Prophet ﷺ, Day of Judgment, sees his ummah, that he will be happy. Sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Ila sharaf al-nabi wa alihi al-Fatiha. Ameen. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless and protect all of you. And thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to sit down and have this important conversation.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank my our Rabata family for allowing this space. And for me, this series has been so healing. And thank you to everyone that joined. Thank you to Sadaf and helping me organize this. And I'm really emotional today. Thank you so much. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much, Ustadha.
Take care,
Assalamu
sisters.
alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.